Texas banks have proudly contributed to the success of our state's economy, but with world-class opportunity comes world-class risk, such as cyber threats. Texas banks are committed to the protection of our customers and communities. It's why the Texas Bankers Association is pleased to sponsor the Texas Tribune Festival.
And I'm Aman, Batheja, political editor here at the Tribune. We have the perfect panel to take on this complicated but really important topic. To my left is Dana DeBeauvoir, who has served as Travis County Clerk since 1986, overseeing Travis County elections and the filing and preservation of property and court records. She has also served as an advisor and election observer in Bosnia, Bangladesh, Kosovo, and South Africa. In 2009, the National Association of Election Officials awarded her with its Minuteman Award for the election security practices she developed. Next, we have Josh Geltzer, is Executive Director of the Institute of Constitutional Advocacy and Protection at Georgetown University. He previously served as Senior Director for Counterterrorism and Deputy Legal Advisor at the National Security Council. Geltzer also serves as a Fellow at the International Security Program of New America, a nonpartisan think tank. Next to him, we have John Dickson, is an internationally recognized security leader, entrepreneur, and principal at Denham Group Limited. A political science major, John is a former intelligence officer who served in the Air Force Information Warfare Center and was a member of the Air Force Computer Emergency Response Team. He's been a cybersecurity expert most of his professional career, helping clients identify security weaknesses before the attackers do. And next we have Keith Ingram, who has served as the director of the Texas Secretary of State's Election Division since 2012. Prior to joining the Secretary of State's office, he worked as appointments manager for Governor Rick Perry. Ingram has also worked as an attorney in private practice. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to direct some questions to you guys, but anyone feel free to jump in. I want this to be a conversation. First off, we're not going to beat around the bush. Early voting starts in Texas in less than a month. I'd like to start off with everyone just answering the same question. Do Texas voters have a reason to be worried that their vote will not be properly counted?
Let me start. No, they do not have a problem with the actual vote itself, but they have reason through social media to think that their information that causes them to make a judgment about their vote will be tampered with.
So that means the
misinformation
that might deter them from voting or might cause them to change their vote.
Exactly.
But not at the actual point of
Not at
voting.
the polling place. I don't think so.
All right. What about you?
So I think this is a very important distinction. I sometimes call it the difference between threats to data integrity. Is the voter roll actually being changed? Is a vote that's been cast actually been changed? Versus threats to discourse integrity. And that discourse can very much affect what votes do get cast on Election Day. And the first one, there are vulnerabilities, there are concerns, but we don't know that it actually has happened before. We don't know that there have actually been votes changed. Whereas the second category, we know that that's happened. We know in the 2016 presidential election, there were hostile foreign actors that did infect the discourse and misled potential voters about candidates' positions, about what they needed to do to vote, when they needed to go to vote. That we know is happening again. We know that from the intelligence community. We know that from tech sector representatives themselves. So there's at least reason to worry in the second category.
I would say that the tabulation component is not a solved problem, but it is has really been improved since 2000 and the whole hanging Chad issue. That has been the focus of the industry, is around the tabulation, integrity of the vote count. I view things from the perspective of an attacker. And when I mean attacker, I mean specifically a nation-state threat, and specifically, most likely, the Russians. They don't care about the tabulation as much as they want to undermine our confidence in the entire election system. And there are far easier ways to do that than monkeying around with voting machines and monkeying around with the text. There's social media, there's ways to do denial of service, there's ways to influence and undermine our confidence separate from the election systems, if that makes sense. And that's what I'm most worried about.
I agree with the previous panelist. Texas voters can vote with confidence that their vote is going to be counted the way they cast it. There is no reason to expect anything different than that. And for the reasons stated, there are other ways that are easier for people to influence the outcome without actually messing with the vote systems themselves.
Keith, I'm actually hoping we could stick with you for a minute and talk about how this, there's been stories of hackers or attacks on voter registration rolls in different states and election websites. Has Texas seen any of that? And do you have any kind of cybersecurity team that's monitoring for that?
We have developed very close relationships with the Chief Information Officer here in Texas, Todd Kimbrell, as well as the Department of Public Safety and Department of Homeland Security. We have confidence that our voter registration system has not been breached. Obviously there are attempts all the time. There are scan attempts that look for vulnerabilities. We have beefed up our voter registration database substantially, the security of it since 2016. We have instituted multi-factor authentication for users of the system, and we have encrypted the data at rest and done some other things that probably we don't need to talk about, but
You don't want to talk about it.
the system is much more secure, and we have not seen a vulnerability. One thing that we have done is we've got an Albert sensor from the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center that is monitoring traffic to and from the voter registration database, so if there were any sort of malicious attack, we would be aware of it pretty quickly.
So, and what makes this issue so complicated is, you're saying that from the state level, but elections are run really at the county level, and it's 254 counties in Texas that are all handling this differently, have different machines and different ways. You can vote differently depending on where you are in the state. Dan, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you've been doing in Travis County to raise confidence in the voting process.
I think the reality is the voter registration database is the one that if an individual were going to be singled out to be attacked, it's probably not going to be the very difficult to the pathway to get to the voting system is not going to be where the attack is going to occur. It's going to be the internet-connected voter registration database.
So not the machines in your mind?
Well, as Spock says, there are always possibilities. But it's not likely, and it's a lot more likely that a bad actor would go for a target that is easier, quicker, cheaper to attack, and they're going to be using their resources and their funds to get to something quicker and easier rather than the most difficult, the most obscure target that they can find. So with voter registration, really all you have to do, as you mentioned, is a denial of service. Just like when other websites get overwhelmed, and the solution to it is, if you're in that position, is you take it down, you reboot it, and you bring it back up. Well, that works fine, and say in the polling place on election day when you're trying to connect to voter registration, except what if it's a bot and it hits you every 5 minutes? Well, what you do is, in those circumstances, is you have backup systems in the polling place. What we have to do is always make sure that our voting continues with the voters no matter what. So what we try to do at the county level is have backup system after backup system to make sure that voters get taken care of, even if we lose connectivity and even if everything doesn't operate perfectly. We've also done the kinds of things that the state level has done too, and connected with Homeland Security, these things at the county level. So an Albert sensor, strengthening the VPNs, using whitelisting and blacklisting, which are ways to cut off anybody coming in to try to connect with those systems that's not legitimate. Somebody trying to update their voter registration address in Travis County with a URL from Europe is clearly not a legitimate person to try to update.
Unless they're a military voter.
And there are things, and so you can do that kind of double checking to make sure that they're okay.
But I would say all the things y'all talked about are stuff that the financial institutions did 15 years ago.
Well, and here,
so for the record, I mean that's great.
And here's the good news about that is that for the internet connected systems, the IT guys who know about this stuff have been dealing with this for years. So these are not pathways that are brand new to the folks who protect them. And we can leave it to John to explain.
No, I'm going to say this. First of all, I would never go after the endpoints when I would go after the aggregation points, which is exactly what they're saying, which puts more pressure on the state. as an Air Force guy, when we did something called targeting, when we went to target and typically blow up things, you don't carpet bomb the planet. You want one bomb to take out one thing that takes out all their telecommunications, all their power. It's called the golden BB is the term that we used. One BB gets everything, right? So that's what the attackers are trying to do too. They don't want to like carpet bomb or like scan the internet. They want to find stuff, like specific things. Here's the other thing that wasn't mentioned. Social engineering. If it's a nation state threat, they are going to understand context. And one thing that they're better at than cyber is espionage and disinformation. And they will go after the things that we talked about, but they'll do it, and they'll also call in and do spear phishing and a much more sophisticated threat. So what's happened is if you look at the banks, the cyber threats are really Eastern European organized crime, and that's a pretty fair fight. And entities that are targeted by the most sophisticated threat, which is the nation state threat, and that is a mismatch. Texas is in a position where we have a big Secretary of State, a very sophisticated IT, and a fraction. Even have an for the other states is they don't even have a function like that. So,
and to pick up on that point, in a sense, there's always strength and resilience in having a disparate system, and at the same time, to the extent that confidence is what's really under attack, and I think the four of us are emphasizing that, it also means that the weakest link is where the confidence can be targeted. So there's been fascinating litigation in Georgia where private plaintiffs have sued the local officials responsible for election security, essentially saying, you didn't take it seriously enough last time, and we're worried you're not taking it seriously enough this time. Now, that's a very hard thing for a court to step in and mandate exactly how many resources, exactly what standards would a court require. But what the litigation shows is the idea that people are concerned about this in all sorts of pockets of the country. And if you go to the attacker's perspective, which John, I think, rightly had us put that hat on earlier, you find the weakest link. And then you target that, and then you try to let a national conversation ensue in which people question, can these results be trusted? Are these results accurate? And in this current polarized fraud environment, so much hangs on the results in a particular county that that's a way to infect the conversation.
So Dana, you're actually in the process of updating the entire voting system in Travis County, and you're talking about how that's not the point of security concerns really, but you're still switching to a system that's going to allow for paper ballots more. And can you talk a little bit about that and why you're doing that if that's not if you don't actually have concerns about that in terms of attacks as much as from other areas?
Right. Well, it's along the lines of if you think a rose is a rose is a rose, but a hack is not a hack. It doesn't really matter if a bad actor has actually traveled along a pathway and gotten to your data, as we mentioned before. What matters is, do people think it's happened? Have they said on social media that they've accomplished a hack? That's all that has to happen. So the important thing is to create, again, systems in place so that voters can be sure that at least what they put into the system can survive those kinds of attacks, even if it's not real. So I think it's important to go ahead and put in voter verified paper audit trails because the voter knows it's correct. It doesn't have anything to do with the probability of whether or not it will get hacked or whether it actually gets hacked. It has to do with whether social media creates that doubt. And yes, we are doing a system in Travis County that will, for many years, the vendor market that sold voting systems would not create a paper trail for voting systems. They wouldn't manufacture it. You couldn't buy it. We had to wait 15 years in order to get one. The one that was certified for Texas happened in April 2017. So all this time, voters have been so patient about getting this paper trail. We've been fighting and arguing and demanding that we needed to have this. There are some good things that happen, though, for our patients and our waiting for the more refined voter paper trail to come about, and that is that the newer systems that are being offered create a paper trail first. The unit that the voter votes on doesn't have any kind of memory. It's not a DRE. It's just a marking device that prevents voters from making mistakes.
But it is a touch screen.
It will be a touch screen, but with capability to assist voters with disabilities. So the paper trail comes out first, and then when the voter confirms it and then puts it in the ballot box, an electronic copy is made from the paper. So you see that it makes it much easier then to start from the back end all the way through and say, yes, in fact, we have a much higher confidence level that the electronic copy matches the paper because that's where it came from. So all new technology, and it's going to be much easier on voters to trust that kind of a system. Even when they hear on social media that, oh yes, we've succeeded in an attack, voters are going to be more likely to say, I'm not so sure I believe that. And one of the things that I hope we've learned from 2016 is don't believe what you hear on social media.
You've
What?
except of course for the Texas Tribune.
Hashtag Texas
Hashtag,
Tribune.
yeah.
Exactly. I just want to add one thing.
Big surprise.
Okay, we talked. I get to see a lot of environments, and I know where the bodies are buried. We do these what are called penetration tests, so we know where the problems are. So people always ask, do you still keep money in the bank? And I'm like, yes, I do. Do I do online transactions? Yes, I do. But I have two-factor authentication for almost all my stuff, right? But I do see the delta between what people are talking about and what is happening out there. And what I would say is, I have confidence what's happening at most of the counties and at the state level. I know these people. We've done work with them. We know them. They may have a near-death experience, but they have their act together.
You say most of the counties. You mean like most of the 254?
I would say most of the major urban counties have their act together. That's my perception. I haven't done work with all of them. Here's the biggest problem we have right now. 2016, what was the big hack? It was for the DNCCC and John Podesta, right? And if you go and look at the DHS's, what they define as election infrastructure and what they support, what are the things that are excluded from that support? Campaigns and political action committees. So there's no talk about the campaign stuff. So two things, we're doing something that we're going to release after the election, after the midterm. You'll like this. One is we are working with a campaign, and we are doing a penetration test of them right now. And the candidate is a colleague of mine who said, you scared the crap out of me the last 10 years. Could you come and do this for me? So we're going to release it after the election, whether he wins or not. And it's very interesting. What we're finding out is it's email, it's different things. It's all these other things you would think. The second thing is we're going to write a piece after the election of how I would blow up your election for $10,000. And that means denial of service, robocalls. There are so many cheap and easy things to do that are not involving some of the infrastructure that could totally undermine that.
So what would a robocall? How would that work?
Okay, maybe the morning of election saying, hey guys, we moved the election polling site to here, or we're postponing it. I mean, there's a lot of different things you could do. I get a call almost every day now asking about extending my car warranty from a 210 number. The ability to inject those into the phone system is so easy. You can go purchase those in the dark web and do that for next to nothing. 10,000 of those, you could, if you're sophisticated enough, you can craft the message. With social media, with other things, you do that in concert, and that has no. So that's the problem, is it's not about the election machines. It never has been, so.
And just to add one point, going back to John recalling that it was Podesta's email, not what we normally think of as the voting machine, that was the vulnerability. There was an interesting letter sent, I think just last week, by Senator Ron Wyden to some of the leadership on the Hill, in which he said, my staff and other staffs have had their personal Gmail, Yahoo, whatever it is, their personal email accounts subjected to spear phishing and other attempts over the past few weeks. And when I contacted the official congressional office that handles cybersecurity, that office said, sorry, our statutory mandate is to do the official stuff. If it's their official accounts, the ones that end in .gov, just let us know how we can help. If it's their Gmail, where they're surely talking about not irrelevant things, our hands are tied.
And they're sharing passwords probably between the two, maybe.
Hopefully
Maybe.
not, but probably they are. And that's probably right. And so and Senator Wyden says, look, if that's how they interpret their statutory mandate, I can't overrule them on that. But this should be an easy fix. Let's pass some legislation to just broaden that mandate. But it turns out that doesn't happen, right? Lots of legislation doesn't get passed. And so we're thinking about this cybersecurity problem in some ways far too narrowly and not comprehensively enough because we're focused on particular pieces worthy of attention, but they're not the whole picture.
Keith, we've heard that Travis County's clearly taking this issue seriously. Other urban areas seem to be doing that. That still leaves like 200 counties. So just wondering kind of, since the last election, what has your office done? Do you communicate a lot with those counties, or is it more they have to come to you?
Yes, we do communicate with the counties on a regular basis. We have made available to all the counties Secure the Human training. We've made that mandatory. We can't really make it mandatory, but we can make it mandatory so that we can track who's actually doing it. We've had over 160 people take us up on that so far. We just instituted it the first part of September, so it's pretty fresh, and that's a pretty good uptake out of about 900 potential users. We also emphasized on day 2 of our seminar this summer for county election officials, cybersecurity. We had Homeland Security come talk, the MSISAC, the EIISAC, they all came and presented both the services that are available as well as the threats that are out there. And so it was kind of overwhelming for some of our more rural counties, but I thought that it was important for them to take this seriously because we want to make sure that that our weakest link is protected. We have also asked in our legislative appropriation request, we've asked for people, 4 people and some travel budget to go visit the counties individually and train them individually. I'm hoping that we get that through the session because I think it's very important that we have boots on the ground at the county level helping them.
The thing I was going to add, I totally agree, and will fully support whatever legislative requests are out there, but the good news is that those small counties, the vote tally is super small. So like, think about it, a lot of the West Texas counties or the rural counties are not going to have hundreds of thousands of votes. So they could literally just call in the vote, and that is a fallback solution as well. So that's the other thing is don't think in terms of 254, think of where the major votes are coming from that could be affected. And a lot of those rural counties can literally call in the tally for the ones that, for the big votes, and it's less of an effect.
Right. The top 30 counties in population in Texas have 78% of the voters.
Well, and so much of the equipment that's used for voting in this state and in this country are from the Help America Vote Act money that came after the 2000 elections. There is some more money coming in. I've read some stuff about how Texas is just not getting nearly enough to properly update its machines, which are now bordering on 20 years old. How much of a problem is that, and are you seeing any solution? It sounds like in Travis County you got local money to help.
We did. The $386 million that Congress just authorized for cybersecurity protections came to about $23 million for Texas. If you don't presume that money should be spent on voting systems, and it shouldn't, then you don't have to deal with the fact that it's painfully short of what is going to be needed.
Like how much is one voting machine?
Well, we're going to be spending about 10 million in Travis County for a new voting system. So if that's roughly the volume that you're looking at. The HAVA money was about $4 billion nationally to buy all new voting systems for everybody nationally. But the point that I was going to make, though, is it is sufficient money if statewide what they do is they focus on some of the things that can be cleaned up using that money. Like, for example, the work that they've already done strengthening their voter registration system, which is statewide. That's an appropriate use, and that's a very good way to start using that money in a way that helps everybody. So I think there are things that can be done with that money. It's just don't make the presumption that it should be used for voting systems, as we've all just newly arrived at the conclusion that's not where the problem is.
I think if $1 is spent on voting machines, that is not what
Yeah,
what
no.
Congress intended.
No.
That doesn't solve the problem at all. It just, at all. And the problem that we're seeing in other states, not in Texas, is that for political reasons, they're having to spread the wealth to the counties who are buying voting systems, but it's not solving that problem. They just, what they realize, these smaller states, if they took, in their instances, it's more like 4 to 6 million per state. If they're taking that money and purely focusing on state level aggregated risk, then they have a political backlash. So they have to spread the money out to the counties and essentially diluting whatever effect it could have. And the numbers are very similar. I think their county, the refresh rate for voting machines is about 12 million. So that makes about sense. So that you add those two counties up.
That's
and
all
then
the federal money.
Oh, no. This is going to be actually local money, really.
It is.
Local money. So that's 12 and 10, and that's two counties out of 254. Start doing the math. It's a ginormous number, and it doesn't solve the problem we're talking about.
Keith, did you want to add anything about that?
What I was going to say is that we're using the bulk of the money for the counties, but it's not for voting equipment. What we have engaged with DIR, they've got a managed security service vendor that we have tailor-made an assessment for county security posture, both cyber as well as physical. And we are encouraging the counties to take us up on that because after the full-blown assessment, we will have some of this money left over to help the counties remediate whatever problems are found.
How many of them have done that up to this point?
We've got expressed interest from 150 or so counties. We've got 35 to 40 that are in the process, and the first assessment is happening even as we speak.
Keith, wanted to ask you something else and have the other panelists join in. The one issue that we've heard about from statewide officials for quite a few years now is the danger of voter fraud. People who are not eligible to vote or just not registered voting, or potentially they're registered but they're voting more than once and getting counted more than once. Hoping you could talk a little bit about how serious of a problem that is in Texas.
Every election we hear reports of fraud. I don't know if y'all remember in the primary there were reports of fraud in the mail ballots in Gregg County as well as in areas around the state, Webb County. And so we hear about that every election. Just yesterday we got a report from a county that they emailed a ballot to a military voter and got 3 of the same ballot back from different people who weren't registered to vote. So obviously somebody copied the balloting materials and gave it to their friends. So fraud happens. I used to, I heard a presentation from an auditor one time, and you only know about how much fraud is caught. You don't know how much fraud happens out there that you're not aware of. And so we have measures in place at the county level as well as at the state level to make sure that voters don't vote more than once. And obviously with the voter ID law that we have, it's more difficult to impersonate other voters. It obviously still happens. Somebody was convicted of that just a few weeks ago. But we try to minimize it to the extent possible. With regard to list maintenance, we have a full-blown list maintenance procedure for deceased persons, for felons, for mentally incapacitated, for people who move. We have instituted a process this year to get known non-citizens from the driver's license rolls removed. We expect to roll that out in January. So we are always thinking about making sure that our voter registration list is as good as it can be.
So there are non-citizens on the rolls, because you say you're rolling that out in January?
We don't know for sure. We've done some preliminary matching, and people who go to the DPS and report that they're here on a visa and they need a driver's license. So we know that there are people in the state who have a driver's license or a personal ID card who are not citizens. We intend in January or late December to match that against our voter rolls and see how many of those persons are also registered to vote.
Do any of you feel that that's
I'll give my own take for what it's worth, which we all start in the same place, right? We all want to see people voting who are actually eligible and entitled to vote. My own take on your question of how overblown is the idea of fraudulent voting, it seems overblown to me. The idea of hostile foreign actors trying to meddle with our elections seems not at all overblown. The idea that people here are trying to cast ballots fraudulently seems to me overblown. Why? Well, there have been some thorough studies to try to document where it's happened, and they've produced very, very little. The president, of course, set up what he called the Election Integrity Commission that was co-chaired by the vice president and Kansas's Secretary of State. Eventually, that commission dissolved. It seemed like they were sort of in search of a a problem that wasn't out there. And just intuitively, our main problem with non-citizens and people who aren't fully here and part of our system is that they don't engage, right? They don't send their kids to school, they don't go to emergency rooms, they don't report crimes or aren't available when crimes are investigated. This is what's at issue in the whole sanctuary city debate. The idea that they would risk all of that to show up and cast one vote when one vote so rarely determines the result of an election, that strikes me as extremely unlikely. The incentive structure is entirely the opposite way. So from where I sit, I would look at the problem more about nefarious actors looking to meddle with our elections, but that's all from a point of agreement that people who are entitled to vote should be the ones voting, and people who are legitimate players in the discourse of an election should be the ones whose voices we're all hearing on social media and actually engaging with.
I would add one thing, and that is the role of voter registration, voter administrator is becoming much more important in our society at the state and local level, because everything you're talking about right there is about the integrity of the vote and fraud. What I'm talking about is on top of that. So the job that they're doing has to do all that stuff. That's what the politicians worry about, is vote tally. And what I'm talking about is an entire new world that you couldn't even conceive of about 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. So the role of state and local administrators around voting, I think the word administrator is a bad word. I think it's CEO of vote count or whatever. The role in our society at our government level, state and local, is just much more important than it was even 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. The only thing I would add to it is that in 31 years of conducting elections, I just haven't seen this so-called fraud. I haven't seen it. Where is it? Apparently it is so minuscule that I wish we would stop wasting our time talking about that piece of it and using that breath, that energy, that time, and focus on turning people out to vote. We spend time on...
I agree.
We spend time on voter registration. We spend time talking about all of this other stuff. But when it comes to actually getting people to the polls, we often drop the ball. Texas has been 49th in the United States in terms of turnout for voting. I hear now that we've dropped to 50th. The old saying is that Texas doesn't have a voting problem; it has a not voting problem.
Well, I'm going to open it up to audience questions in just a moment. I just have one more question. I'm sorry, one sec.
It's a very eager audience.
Yeah. Just in case there was something I didn't bring up that you want to talk about, I wanted to ask if you could tell federal or state lawmakers one thing you think they should be doing to tackle election security, improve election security, what would it be?
Email voting is internet voting, and if it's connected to the internet, you've just increased yourself as a target. But I really do think we need to, as Americans, switch our thinking to protecting ourselves and our culture from attack, not so much the infrastructure.
And in a similar vein, my urging to the federal government would be share information as to what the ongoing threats are now, the ones to discourse integrity, especially with the tech sector. And here, I draw a little bit on the work I did in counterterrorism, where the government is really good at, the federal government is really good at ingesting information on national security and really bad about pushing it out. It's just not built to do that. It's built to ingest, store, keep secure, which they don't always do with success, but that's at least how the system is made. But right now, you have a tech sector that, in my view, is trying and also falling short. Those are both true in their efforts to at least do more with respect to the midterms this year than they did with respect to the 2016 presidential elections. And you have accounts of the federal government showing up in meetings that the tech sector is calling to talk about what both sides are seeing in terms of who's interfering with this election, what are they saying, and at least the tech sector shows up ready to talk about what they're seeing. The federal government is saying, oh, we're just here to listen. That is not an acceptable place to be. The government has analysts looking at what's happening, learning, seeing trends across platforms, and they need to figure out a way to push that out and push it out essentially in real time, at least at some unclassified level, so that not only our dedicated county and state officials know about it, but also those in the private sector who are in some ways on the front lines of the discourse integrity problem.
The rhetoric undermining our elections right now, I think I have a very outside-in view of the world because I was an intelligence officer, and I really, when I first started commenting about this stuff in 2016, I was somewhat skeptical, but I realized, you know what, those guys are smart over there, and they jumped on a situation, and the environment was ripe because of all the talk about fake news and whatever. It just, if you think about it, dirty campaigning and over-the-top rhetoric is just one shy level away from information warfare. I mean, essentially, you can start to insert streams of slightly ridiculous stuff from the other side if the stuff that we're saying on this end is over the top, if that makes sense. If you divorce it from any concept of fact, what we're saying, then you make the environment on this end ripe for manipulation from the outside. You make the target, if everybody is worried that the guys are liars or complete liars, then it's easy to talk and shape that dialogue from the outside. It's easier to manipulate. Politicos are adding to that, over the top in the environment.
Keith, is there anything you tell state lawmakers or to federal lawmakers?
What I would say is that security of the election systems is a process and an ongoing thing. It's not a destination that you arrive at, and so we need to think differently about how we engage on it comes down to money. And so if you want an ongoing security process, this $23 million that we're getting from the federal government is going to help. It's going to really get all of the counties up to a baseline level, and we're looking forward to that. But what happens next year and the year after that and the year after that, that's what I'm concerned about, is an ongoing approach to security is going to take resources.
What he said. Let me correct. I absolutely believe now that the talk and the rhetoric far outstrips the resource allocation at the state level. So, everyone's kind of concerned about it, but they need to spend money to fix this. This doesn't happen on its own. I totally agree. Good answer.
Can I add one piece too, which is to piggyback on that? Yes to resources, but also yes to sheer political will. And let me give one example of that. There has been something sitting in Congress called the Honest Ads Act. This should be the easiest fix in the world. It takes the current regime that says if you're doing a newspaper ad or you're doing a television ad, and at the end you have to say who paid for it. We're all used to hearing those disclaimers, and they sound a little goofy, but they are important for showing at least where some money is flowing into political advertising, essentially. The Honest Ads Act says apply that to the internet. That's all it says. This existing regime that we've all agreed on, bipartisan sponsors, hasn't moved. Just sheer lack of political will. So dollars also come from political activity, but so does, that costs the federal government $0 to take that regime and just essentially update it for the digital age, and it hasn't gotten done.
Why hasn't it? You say political will, is it the House, the Senate, the White House?
It hasn't moved to a floor vote on either side. I think it's partly because the White House has not only not endorsed it, but seems to be desiring that it doesn't move. That seems to come from a place in the White House where suggesting that there's online disinformation almost calls into doubt the results of the last election. They seem not to want to touch that issue. But that doesn't stop the legislature, obviously, from moving it on its own and pushing it to the president's desk. And it seems like there's a lot of legislation that should move and just doesn't due to sheer inaction.
Well, so this has been fascinating. I'm going to open it up to the audience, and I think we have someone with a microphone. First, this man over here in the blue who...
Hi. Back when I was a news reporter for the Austin Chronicle, I covered Travis County's implementation of electronic voting. Hi, Dana. How you been?
Hi.
I remember you specifically chose the system you did because you didn't trust touch screens. You picked a system with a screen, but it was not a touch screen. Now you're saying you're going to implement a touch screen. And you said that you were concerned about the touchpad underneath the screen slipping out of alignment. Do you still have that fear, or has the technology improved?
Yes and yes. Yes, I don't like touchscreen, but the market has left me behind. There are no longer any touch buttons, tactile systems like the one we did have.
You're talking about those ones with like the wheel.
The wheel,
yeah.
like a telephone dial. I wish I could still have a tactile system, because with that tactile system you get a common voting system that everybody uses, able, disabled, it does not matter. We're all voting identically. The marketplace doesn't offer that anymore. We have to use touchscreen. The only reason I'm comfortable with moving ahead with it is that calibration, which was a serious issue before, does seem to be resolved. You know, we're way far down the line in terms of product development. It is resolved. I think we're going to be fine with it. All of the systems do come with, each and every one of them, come with a tactile pad that can be it's just attached right there on the side. You just pull it out and use it right there. So at any point in time, if we're unhappy with the touch screen, they can immediately be converted to tactile. I think that's the best I can do with this marketplace.
Cindy Weatherby with the League of Women Voters, and Keith made note that they are going to be looking at the undocumented or non-citizens who are on the DPS rolls, but I'd like him to also discuss the difference between a hard match and a soft match and how they intend to use those.
That's a good question. There's been, for years, stories of people who had similar names finding they were taken off the rolls by accident. How does Texas avoid that problem?
So you want to talk about matching? Matching is complicated. You know, when you take a data set with a lot of fields and another data set with a lot of fields and some of them overlap, it's always a challenge to see if the person over here is the same as the one over here. We understand that this is a pretty serious project, and that's the reason why we've been working on it for a full year already before rolling it out, because we want to make sure that the data that we get out of it is good data and that we are not taking anybody off the rolls that shouldn't be taken off the rolls. And importantly, every single person that comes in with a match is going to get a letter saying it appears from our records that you're not a citizen. You need to tell us whether you are or not and prove it. So we're going to give people the opportunity to stay on the rolls if they can prove their citizenship. And so that's a very important thing. Nobody's going to be removed arbitrarily or without notice. And we're very aware of the importance of matching well.
I mean, it's a hard problem. Think of all the TSA no-fly lists. You know, I've got a bunch of folks that work for me that have names from the Middle East, and that's what they worry about all the time. Is when they fly, was their name translated similarly, you know, to a ISIS person on a list, you know? And so that is a societal problem, period. I mean.
Taking my question. Statistically, first of all, let me premise this. We always hear that there's fraud about voting, but statistically, what do you have in regards to ineligible voters that have attempted or have voted in the state of Texas?
What proof are you asking about?
Yes, statistically, what percentage is there?
Keith, do you have any information on that?
No, not at the state level.
I got nothing.
It feels like a lot of the stories that have emerged in the past few years it's been almost entirely mail-in ballots. Is that accurate?
I would agree with that. There are a few in-person voter fraud attempts, but mainly it's the mail ballot system that is at risk.
But the state doesn't have any data of, you know,
we do not.
Calculating known cases or something like that.
We know how much we've heard about. We know what we've referred over to the Attorney General for investigation. The Attorney General has a list of what they're working on, if anybody's interested in getting that from them, because we can't disclose what we've referred over to the OAG. But that's all we know about is, you know, and the local prosecutors have the opportunity to prosecute as well, and we don't have any visibility into that.
So I know there were
Discretion. Yeah.
there was a couple of cases in Tarrant County where people were convicted for illegally voting, and at least in one of the cases, the person just did not know they were not allowed to vote. They didn't hide it. They showed up and gave their name and everything and tried to vote. So that's the Secretary of State's office isn't involved with those cases.
And on this, you know, the Maine's Secretary of State, who was serving on that commission I mentioned, the Pence-Kobach Commission, now defunct, Maine's Secretary of State asked essentially the question you're asking. He said, all right, I've been picked to serve on this. Let's see where the data is on fraudulent voting. And couldn't, even as a commission member, got no answer to that. And so that in part seems to be why the commission went away. It seemed to be in search of a problem that didn't exist and couldn't be documented.
We've secured the discourse, we've secured the voter rolls. What are the technical challenges around making it easier for Texans to get on the voter rolls when they are allowed to be there? Many states have implemented some kind of online voter registration. Texas still requires a paper ballot with a paper application with a signature. What are the challenges there?
You want to talk about online voter registration in the ledge?
So there's been a bill every session that I've been in this job for online voter registration, and it hasn't passed yet.
It came very close 2 sessions ago.
Yeah. I would point out that all 4 of the questions thus far have been about voter fraud and vote tabulation and not the actual security of vote. So just a little.
You guys were just that convincing.
No, I'm just saying, like, that has been a societal problem since we started voting.
Exactly.
But it's not the topic of this particular panel.
Although it's important, right? Because if you talk about the integrity of voting, the idea of ensuring that people who are eligible have a path that isn't onerous to them. And
No, we know that. I mean, but that's been forever, right?
People who haven't been voting, it's very important.
No, it's very important, but that's not, yeah.
I, for what it's worth, I think when we talk about it may not be cybersecurity, but it seems to me the idea of understanding the integrity of voting as ensuring that we're focused on the right threats and not the wrong ones, and ensuring that people get there, those who are entitled and eligible, get their day at the ballot box. That's part of what makes voting, gives it an integrity for all members of the community who are entitled.
Of course.
You said a couple sessions ago a bill almost passed.
Yes, the online voter registration, it's been up every year, and 2 sessions ago it almost passed, and then since then the air has gone out of the balloon. It's completely been stalled.
Is there a major point against it you hear? Is it just
No.
concerns about fraud?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, which senator?
Why did legislation
Why?
move? Why didn't legislation
I mean,
why does legislation
ultimately,
move?
it's 1 or 2 people probably that we don't want to throw out their
Name,
names,
yeah.
right?
That have
It's
just
probably what
stopped
it
it.
is.
After the panel, you guys can tell me then.
Yeah, I bet you I know the answer.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Sandy. I'm from San Antonio. I'm a retired educator. And we formed a group of educators, principals, counselors, retired teachers. When we found out we were 50th on the voter participation, we got together, got certified as VDRs, and started registering. In the last 5 years, we've registered 15,000 seniors to vote. So my concern is more...
Yay.
I'm with Dana. I'm worried about what's coming domestically from within. That's me personally. I have a twofold question. This year, there are more people registered. The record number of people have been registered to vote. Are we prepared, if they all turn out, to get them, keep them from standing in long lines? And secondly, we've heard about many states purging voters for non-participation. Has Texas purged any voters, and if so, how many?
We do not have the non-participation as a trigger for a purging process, so we don't have that in Texas at all. It's not part of our system. Right now, as far as registered voters, as of last Thursday, we had 15.6 million registered. That's a new record going into this election. We expect that number to increase as we get closer to the voter registration deadline, which is October the 9th. So if you're not registered, or if you have friends that aren't registered, they have time to do it. Just make sure that it is in by October the 9th. That's my plug, and see if we can get us to 16 million. I'm sort of pulling for 16 million. Anecdotally, in the special election for District 19 that we just had, we had calls that day on election day wondering why they couldn't vote on the rest of the ballot. People are anxious to vote. So
There you go.
I expect turnout to be big on the first few days of early voting.
There you go.
Just to add, I think a lot of counties are doing what we're doing here in Travis County, and that is treating this election with funding and outreach at the presidential level. So we've upped polling places and workers and everything we can think of to try to do that. And my hope is, you know, please God, don't let voters break our hearts again. So many times they've promised us that they're going to turn out, and I would welcome a huge surge. To go more to your point though about outreach and voter education, we've got to teach and train voters and get the word out to them that they have to plan to vote, because if they just simply follow human nature and show up at the last minute, they're going to do damage to themselves. They're going to create what we're trying to avoid. We put all this money and resources into early voting and into lots and lots of vote centers and polling places on election day, only to see those resources not used during the early part, and then voters complain because they see lines at the end. We need help, and we need to get the word out to voters that this is a self-inflicted wound that they can do something about, and we all need help solving this problem. It's not cool, it's not good for voters to wait in line 2 or 3 hours.
Vote early, but not often.
Yeah, vote, plan to vote early, and plan to take somebody with you.
Yes, in the back over there.
My question is more about, like, what was the justification and the reasoning for going to electronic voting in the first place? And does that still make sense today, especially if you need machines and the lines are super long? Like, and if you're doing a paper, like, receipt from these machines, aren't you just creating a really expensive, like, pen?
Yeah. No, I love this question. If you'll honor me by letting me take it. All right, here's why electronic voting is very good, despite the pounding you've heard for all these years. All right, here's the things that you get from electronic voting. You get the capability to offer to blind and disabled voters the exact same civil rights that are afforded to you, the privacy and secrecy of an independently cast ballot. You also get the capability for outreach programs that you could never offer with a paper ballot only, even if it was an optical scan ballot, unless you're a very small jurisdiction. And I do mean that manual paper ballot or optical scan. For example, you couldn't, if you were a jurisdiction of any size at all, you couldn't offer early voting, which is required in the state of Texas, with a paper ballot. We did paper ballots here in Travis County until it killed us, until the weight of it was so bad that we simply could not do it anymore. Imagine if you're trying to stock an inventory of ballots for 900 neighborhoods, 900 individual formats, just in Travis County at 30 early voting locations. So you're piling up paper after paper at these locations, trying to predict which voter is going to show up at which one. Now you have a very commonplace security problem with paper, because you have to track every single security serial number. You have to count every single one of them. It's just like dollar bills at a bank, and you have to do that every single day. The logistics of it just weigh down so heavily, you have to stop doing those kinds of programs with a paper ballot only. When you get to election day, with the crush of all the people coming in, it's an even worse problem with, let's say, 150 vote centers with 900 neighborhoods or ballot formats that you're trying to keep stocked. How are you going to predict which voter is going to show up at which place and that you've got a ballot ready for them? And if you do run out, then your backup program is to call the next door neighbor vote center and say, hey, have you got some extra copies for neighborhood 123? And they bring them over, and you have to document that trade process too. It gets to be way too complicated, and you quickly lose track of it out in the field. Here's one more reason why electronic voting is so cool.
It's a really cool thing.
Very cool.
It allows you to have fast, accurate results for election night, results of the election on election night. And voters love that more than anything else. So they love early vote centers, and they love fast election night results, and that makes them feel comfortable with the election. That coupled with a paper trail, which they verify themselves, now you've got best of both worlds.
I believe, I think Tarrant County is one of the large urban counties that still offers paper ballots on election day, but you have to go to your polling place.
That's exactly
you can't just
right.
go anywhere in the county, which I would imagine is a hamper on turnout.
They don't have vote centers, and you can't do vote centers and have a paper system because of the, how are you going to plan for that much? And even if you were trying to print a ballot in the polling place, you didn't pre-print, which is incredibly expensive. You were going to print it there. It's called ballot on demand. The kind of printer that you need to do that with enough quality to be read in a reader later on sucks so much electricity it usually crashes wherever you are. If you're in, I mean, it's true, you have to think about electricity. If you're in a school building or an old church or something, and where is it that we have the least capable infrastructure or the least modern infrastructure? It's in the poorer parts of town. So the good parts of town get to use ballot on demand and the poorer parts of town don't. Another reason to just stick with electronic voting with the paper trail.
I was curious if you could say something about, I guess, the future for online voting. I think there's at least one state that allows it. And I'm thinking more from the technology perspective, not the political perspective.
I just served on a national panel that we published a book. It was done by the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. The title of the book is Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy. Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy. It is online, so all you have to do is go online to read it. We offered 41 recommendations for how to better secure democracy. The number one thing we said was we need a paper trail, but it was either the second or the third recommendation that said absolutely not, no internet voting, because internet voting is email voting, and you're going to get hacked just like John Podesta. There is no internet voting today that has a pathway that can be secured. Now, we do use a situation where you can email a blank ballot, especially to overseas and military. They can get a blank ballot, print it out, and that's a fast way to get to people when sometimes it's hard to find them in the field. So that's a good thing. We can use it for that, and that's safe. But sending back a voted ballot on a transmission line that proven is going to be hacked, why on earth would you do that?
My counter to that as an ex-military guy is, what about the hundreds of thousands of troops that are overseas that mail in ballots that don't get counted? I mean, like, the reality of this is the major banks of the world are able to do this every single day, and the problem is, in order to do that, you have to do more sophisticated security things like two-factor authentication. If we were to do that, then we would lose, then we would have voter access issues, because the vast majority of our citizenry are not going to adopt two-factor authentication to vote securely. So technically, to be done, it is just, it has all these other impacts, and then cost. How much are we willing to spend as a society to get that degree of confidence?
At the state election director meeting in Philadelphia this summer, West Virginia made a presentation. They did a pilot program for military voters to vote over the internet using the blockchain. It was a very interesting presentation. I think West Virginia is going to roll that pilot program statewide for this November. So internet voting using the blockchain is occurring in at least one state for military voters that are overseas. And so we'll see what happens, but I agree it'll take resources if we're going to do it successfully and securely.
I mean, when I was deployed, I didn't get mail for months. I did.
In addition to the interesting test that Keith mentioned, there's another kind of data point of how this may evolve coming up, which is the 2020 census is going to be the first digital census in our country's history. A couple other countries like Australia have done digital censi.
Is that a word?
I don't know.
Is that a word?
Whenever I talk about it,
Who went to Latin? Who took their Latin classes in here? Anybody?
It was a mixed result. They suffered a DDoS attack in the middle of it. They had to pause it, regroup. There have been some concerns expressed, including by me and other former government colleagues, that it's not clear how ready we are for that. Both individual respondents are going to have the opportunity to respond, and the estimate is that about 40% of the responses in 2020, the Census Bureau expects to be digital. But in addition to that, the people doing the in-person counting, traditionally it's all been in person, will themselves be entering the results on a iPhone or some sort of electronic tablet that then sends the results back. So all of this, I get why the Census Bureau is doing this. Over time, it will be cheaper. It's not cheaper yet. It's actually more expensive to put it in place, but over time, it should be cheaper after you do this for a couple of cycles. It should also do what every census aims to do, which is get to as many people as possible. But especially in its first iteration, it will be an interesting data point as to, are people at the end confident that everything that came in from your phones or computers, from the people who show up at your doors and then enter it electronically, is there a high level of confidence in what that ultimate pot is?
Right. If I could just add one more thing, emailing a blank ballot to a military or overseas voter, what you're doing is you're covering the territory that's the slowest part, trying to get the ballot to them, to find them. You can email it to the field, which is you probably didn't have that option when you were in the field.
Back in the Vietnam War? No,
Yeah,
that was actually,
right. Didn't happen back
Desert
then.
Storm, Desert Storm.
Desert Storm, right.
Okay.
But now we can email it to them so that we can get it to them quicker, and they don't have to have so much risk for it. Mailing it back, though, means that their voted ballot is not put at a known risk more than everybody else who's participating in the election. So there are ways that we can protect them. And the blockchain thing that's happening in West Virginia with VOAS is also being placed under severe criticism, because for blockchain to work perfectly, or work correctly, I guess, there's a question about the secrecy of the ballot. So all of these are, we're not going to be able to discuss all of this, the pros and cons of it here. By all means, if you'll go look at Securing the Vote, Protecting American Democracy, you'll see all of the research that's been done on this in the bibliography, and it'll give you a lot of information, including VOAS.
One last question over there in the letter jacket.
My name is Bumi Oni, and I'm from the Ann Richards School. I come with the Polaris Press. And I have a question for me and my newly 18-year-olds. What can we do to vote securely, and what can we do to stay informed about this issue?
Well, you're here, which is great.
Yeah, that's a good start.
I have one thing to say, which again will bring us back to this discourse integrity that I think all of us are worried about, which is especially people who are, and it's wonderful, engaged in political discourse online these days and reading things on Facebook pages and on Twitter and elsewhere. Actually read things before you repost them, retweet them, like them. There's studies that show that roughly half of what gets reposted and retweeted in general, not just about politics, people have read the title and the subtitle.
I'll stop
doing
one
that.
word.
But don't do that.
I'll stop doing
Not for our
that.
democracy.
Usually they're funny memes, though. That's a little different. It's like
But if people pause and they really digest it and they go, does this seem right? Did the Pope really endorse Donald Trump? Pause on this stuff and don't let it spread. If that is wherever you fall on the political spectrum, if there's a pause on that, that would be a really valuable step.
I'm going to say what John Kerry said last night, which is, having gone to different countries and seen people wait in line for the opportunity to vote for the first time in 50 years. And here we are, like, our choices. Do we go vote, or do we go, Starbucks and hang out for, be mindful. You have to bring your friends. We have to change the way we interact. I mean, I cannot believe the voting, we're number 50. I mean, that should be shameful as Texans. We should, we're number one in everything. How the hell did that happen? I'm joking. I'm being facetious. But
Let me. I'm sorry. Let me just add one.
yeah.
Let me just add one more thing to you. Plug for the League of Women Voters. They provide the best information ever.
Yeah, there you go. Hey.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but I want to thank our panel for. Sorry about that, but sorry. But thank our panel, and hopefully they'll stick around to answer any more questions you have. Please give them applause.
Well done.
Sorry about that.